The metal that bought the world. Imagine you are standing in a dusty field in Judea, roughly 2,000 years ago. You are not a philosopher, a politician, or a soldier. You are a farmer named Eli. You own a small plot of land, barely 3 acres, which is just enough to sustain your family in a good year. But as you look at your ripening grain, you aren't thinking about the beauty of the harvest. You are thinking about the math. To your left, a Roman centurion stands as the human personification of the most efficient extraction machine the ancient world has ever seen. To your right, the local elite who manage the Jerusalem temple represent the most sophisticated central bank of the Mediterranean. This is a story about silver, the cold, hard metal that fueled the Roman legions, built the marble palaces of the elite, and ultimately tightened a financial noose around the neck of the ancient world during the time of Jesus. Most people view the first century through a lens of theology or Hollywood epics, but to understand the world as it was actually lived, you have to look at the ledgers. This was a world defined by a 0.00 GDP paradox. While Rome looked wealthy and the temple shone with gold, the average person was living through a slow-motion economic collapse that had been decades in the making. In this analysis, we are going to strip away the myths and perform a financial autopsy. We are going to break down how silver was used as a weapon of systemic debt, why the Jerusalem temple was a monopoly on hard money, and why a carpenter from Nazareth wasn't just a preacher. He was the most dangerous market disruption in the history of capital. Part 1. The Roman business model. Macro extraction. To understand the first century economy, you have to understand that Rome was not a nation in the sense we think of today. It was a corporate entity whose primary product was stability and whose primary revenue stream was plunder and interest. By the time of Augustus and Tiberius, the Roman Empire had moved out of its high-growth phase, conquering new lands, and into its optimization phase. When you run out of new neighbors to rob, you have to start squeezing the ones you already have. This is where the concept of extraction economics comes in, the philosophy of the boot. In modern economics, we talk about inclusive institutions. These are systems that encourage people to innovate because they get to keep the fruits of their labor. Rome was the opposite. It was an extractive institution. The goal was to maintain a senior seigniorage, a fancy way of saying they wanted to control the value of money while taking a cut of every single transaction that occurred under the Roman eagle. For a province like Judea, the macro view was bleak. Judea was a peripheral economy. It didn't produce the high-value luxury goods of the East or the massive grain surpluses of Egypt. It produced olives, wine, and highly rebellious people. Therefore, Rome's fiscal policy for Judea was focused on maximum feasible extraction. The tax farming mechanism, the Publicani. How do you collect taxes in a world without digital banking or a centralized IRS? You outsource it. This is where the Publicani come in. These were private contractors. Think of them as ancient private equity firms. Rome would hold an auction in the forum. They would say, "We need 10 million denarii from the province of Judea this year. Who wants the contract?" A wealthy syndicate would bid 10 million and pay it to the Roman treasury up front. Now, that syndicate owned the right to collect taxes in Judea. This created a moral hazard of epic proportions. The Publicani didn't want to collect 10 million, they wanted to collect 15 million. The extra 5 million was their profit margin. Because they had the backing of the Roman military, they could use enhanced collection techniques, violence, to ensure they hit their targets. This system ensured that the tax burden on the average farmer was always 20% to 30% higher than what was actually recorded in the Roman Senate's books. Part 2. The silver trap, the velocity of debt. Let's move from the Senate floor to the dirt floor of our farmer Eli. To understand why the society was collapsing, we have to look at the velocity of debt. In 30 AD, most Judean farmers lived on what we call subsistence plus. You grew enough to eat, plus a small surplus to pay for necessities. But the system was designed to ensure that the surplus never stayed in your hands. The requirement of silver Rome didn't want your grain. They wanted silver. This forced subsistence farmers into the market. Eli had to sell his food to get the Roman denarius required for taxes. This created a massive downward pressure on prices during harvest season, and an upward pressure during the winter. The farmers were always selling low and buying high. The triple tax burden. Eli wasn't just paying one tax, he was paying 3. 1. The Roman land tax, tributum soli, usually 10 to 12% of your harvest, payable regardless of whether the weather was good or bad. 2. The Roman poll tax, tributum capitis, a flat tax for the privilege of being a Roman subject. 3. The religious tithe, another 10% for the upkeep of the temple and the priestly class. When you add these up, Eli is starting his year 30% to 40% in the red. Now, imagine a year of drought. If Eli's harvest drops by 50%, he no longer has enough to pay the taxes and feed his family. The foreclosure cycle. In the modern world, if you can't pay your debts, you declare bankruptcy. You lose your credit score, but you keep your life. In the ancient world, there was no bankruptcy. There was only debt slavery. When Eli couldn't pay his taxes, he went to a local lender. These lenders were the local elites, wealthy landowners who lived in the cities and were often connected to the temple hierarchy. They would lend Eli the money at interest rates ranging from 25% to 50%. The collateral for the loan? Eli's land. This created a land consolidation effect. Over a generation, thousands of small family farms were liquidated into massive plantations called latifundia. The people who used to own the land were now tenant farmers. They lived in the same houses, worked the same dirt, but they gave 50% of their crop to a landlord in Jerusalem. They had become the working poor in the most literal sense. Part 3. The Temple, the central bank of the ancient world. To understand why the system was so stable and so hated, we have to look at the Jerusalem Temple. We usually think of the temple as a church. To a financial historian, the temple was a monopoly bank and a sovereign wealth fund. The currency monopoly. The temple was the only place in the region that could safely store large amounts of silver, but it had a unique financial product, the Tyrion Shekel. Under religious law, every male had to pay a yearly temple tax. But the temple authorities refused to accept Roman denarii. Why? Because Roman coins bore the face of Caesar, an idol, and more importantly, because Rome was constantly debasing its currency. Rome was doing what modern governments do. They were mixing copper into the silver coins to make the money go further. The temple elite, being savvy hard money advocates, demanded payment in Tyrion shekels, a coin with 94% silver purity. The arbitrage of the money changers. When a farmer like Eli came to the temple, he had to exchange his debased Roman or local currency for the high-purity Tyrion shekel. This is where the money changers come in. They weren't just service providers, they were market makers. They set the exchange rate. Because the tax was mandatory, the demand for the shekel was inelastic. The money changers could charge a 10% or 15% convenience fee on the exchange. This was a massive wealth transfer. The temple was essentially shorting the Roman currency and longing silver, all while taking a transaction fee from the poorest people in the land. The wealth of the temple grew to be so vast that it was one of the largest concentrations of capital in the Roman East. Part 4. The social tipping point. The lesti. When you push a population past the extraction point, they don't just starve quietly. They move into the shadow economy. By 30 AD, the hills of Galilee and Judea were crawling with people the Romans called lesti. In our Bibles, this is translated as thieves or robbers. But a more accurate modern term would be social bandits or insurgents. These were not career criminals. These were former farmers, men like Eli, who had been foreclosed upon. Having lost their land, their status, and their future, they fled to the caves. They survived by raiding the transport wagons of the wealthy and the tax collectors. This was a failed state indicator. The official economy was so extractive that the only way to survive was to leave it. The systemic risk was off the charts. The elites in Jerusalem were sitting on a mountain of gold, surrounded by a sea of debt-ridden, landless people with nothing left to lose. Part 5. The Disruptor. A new fiscal policy. This is the exact moment when a carpenter from Nazareth enters the public stage. To understand his impact, we have to stop reading his words as poetry and start reading them as economic theory. The Jubilee narrative. When Jesus stood up in his hometown and announced the year of the Lord's favor, he was referencing an ancient Hebrew economic law called the Jubilee. Under the Jubilee law, every 50 years, the economy was supposed to reset. All debts were canceled. All slaves were freed. All land was returned to its original family owners. It was the ultimate deleveraging event. For a population drowning in Roman and temple debt, this was the most radical stimulus package ever proposed. But for the temple elite, the creditor class, this was a declaration of war. If the people actually believed the Jubilee was coming, the value of the temple's loan portfolio would drop to zero. The temple cleansing as a financial strike. The most famous violent act of Jesus, cleansing the temple, was a targeted strike on the financial infrastructure. By flipping the tables of the money changers, he wasn't just making a scene. He was shutting down the currency exchange. He was stopping the flow of hard money into the temple treasury. He called the temple a den of robbers, using that same word, lesti. He was saying that the priests were the real bandits, using the sacred tax to liquidate the houses of the poor. From a senior analyst perspective, this was market disruption on a scale the Romans couldn't ignore. He was telling the debtors that the creditors had no moral or legal right to their labor. Part 6. The forensic breakdown of the 30 pieces of silver. To truly understand the story, we have to look at the most famous financial transaction in history, the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas. Why 30? In the Torah, 30 shekels of silver was the price of a slave. By paying exactly this amount, the temple elite were making a statement about Jesus' market value. They weren't just buying an informant. They were signaling that this disruptor was worth no more than a foreclosed farmer. But there's a deeper economic irony here. Those 30 pieces were almost certainly Tyrion Shekels, the high-purity silver stored in the temple treasury. The very silver extracted from farmers like Eli was used to fund the liquidation of the man who promised to cancel their debts. Part 7. The Great Correction, 70 AD. However, the correction was only delayed. You cannot solve a structural debt crisis with a crucifixion. Over the next 30 years, the extraction ratio in Judea became unbearable. The middle class vanished entirely. In 66 AD, the powder keg finally exploded. The social bandits and the debt-ridden peasants seized Jerusalem. The very first thing the rebels did when they took the city was not to go to the armory. They went to the archives and burned the debt records. They wanted to destroy the software of their oppression, the ledger that said they owed their lives to the elite. Rome's response was a total liquidation. They sent in Titus and 4 legions. They besieged the city, causing a famine that decimated the population. When they finally broke through, they didn't just kill the rebels. They dismantled the economic engine. They burned the temple to the ground and literally pried the stones apart to get the gold and silver that had melted into the cracks. The temple's sovereign wealth fund was hauled back to Rome in a massive victory parade. That silver was then used to fund the construction of the Colosseum. It is a bitter irony of history. The wealth extracted from the poor of Judea was used to build a stadium to distract the poor of Rome. Part 8. The Lessons for the Modern Analyst. Why does this matter today? Because the 0.00 GDP paradox is not a relic of the past. It is a recurring feature of human systems. When we look at our modern world, we see the same patterns. 1. Debt to GDP ratios that exceed the ability of the population to pay. 2. Asset consolidation, where a smaller and smaller percentage of the population owns the land, or the stocks and real estate. 3. Currency debasement, where the official money loses purchasing power, forcing people into hard assets or shadow economies. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of a single battle. It fell because it became too expensive to maintain. The cost of extraction eventually became higher than the value extracted. When the average person, the Eli of the world, decides that the system is no longer a partner but a predator, the social contract dissolves. In 30 AD, a new narrative was introduced. It was a narrative that suggested a world where the last are first, where wealth is measured by generosity rather than accumulation, and where forgiveness, debt cancellation, is the foundation of a stable society. Rome chose the ledger. The people chose the story. Today, we are still living in the tension between the two. Every time a central bank adjusts an interest rate or a government debates a debt ceiling, we are participating in the same ancient struggle that took place in a dusty field in Judea. The question remains, are we building an economy of extraction or an economy of participation? Because history has shown us time and time again, if you squeeze the orange too hard, eventually there is nothing left but the peel, and a peel cannot support an empire.